And I can tell you that those of us who wrote about Japan in 1987, and these were the glory years, could never have imagined that 22 years later they would be producing the same amount of manufacturers, because Japan is, of course, so export dependent. Globally, of course, the idea of decoupling is now dead, as emerging economies are incredibly hit hard by the loss of external demand from countries like the US, UK, the other big importers, and indirectly by the loss of external finance, and that's particularly important for Central and Eastern Europe. Deep recessions are certain in the US and Europe. No significant spending offsets can conceivably occur in the rest of the world, and that's why I believe there's going to be a very prolonged slowdown. I find it very difficult to believe in the optimistic forecast for growth. This, by the way, no forecast is worth anything. This is what's happened to the forecast, the consensus of forecasts for the output for the developed world in 2009, since the first set of forecasts put together in January 2008. Just to give you some idea of how wrong they were, if you take the Japanese case, in January 2008, they expected the Japanese economy to grow by 2%. They now expect it to shrink by 4%. The other developed countries are all expected to shrink about 2 to 2.5%. The world as a whole is now forecast to shrink for the first time since the 1930s. So this is a pretty significant event. This is what this picture for developing countries looks like, and you'll be interested to know that China and India look much more robust than the Asia-Pacific region, Eastern Europe, or Latin America, all of which have collapsed. This really is a synchronized global recession as the corrective forces work through with incredible violence and speed. This is the IMF's growth forecast for next year. They, of course, put in a wonderfully vigorous recovery in 2010. There isn't the slightest reason to believe that, but the IMF would not be allowed to print anything else. I mean that quite literally. They could not get away with printing anything else. So just focus on what they're showing for 2009. So what is going to happen next, and what are the reform implications? I've gone over a little, so I'm going to try and cut it down to 5 minutes. I started a few minutes late, so I'm within my time, I think. First of all, there is a story you can tell. I just wanted to stress that there is a story of really quite swift recovery. There are some good things that are happening. We have much lower oil prices. That's a shift of income to consumers. We have much lower interest rates, extremely aggressive monetary policy. We have some massive fiscal boosts, mostly in the US and China, not really elsewhere. I tend to think they're too small. We have a significant reduction in risk spreads in markets across the globe, and therefore some people will say demand in the rest of the world, in the deficit countries, will be soon restored, and that will generate business as usual. The problem I have with that is essentially we have a massive debt overhang in the private sector, particularly the household sector, and the core of the driver for demand was consumption. And I don't see how you get a real consumer boom out in the Western world again when house prices are collapsing, asset values are collapsing. It's incredibly implausible. It's much more likely that there's been a structural rise in savings, and that's been shown in the very, very weak demand. So I regard this as, it's not impossible, but it's a very low probability event. It's a low probability event. Another event, which I think is also about equally likely, is that we are actually in a breakdown period. That this is, we've discussed this, an epochal event, and the integrated global system is in the process of disintegrating. And I'm just going to list some of the factors that might deliver that. Continued rapid rise in desired savings, ineffective fiscal stimulus, mass bankruptcy, and soaring unemployment. We see all these things happening. Friction between deficit and surplus countries, with the deficit countries telling the surplus countries they're not expanding demand enough. Major currency crises are possible. These are forecasts. And then protectionism and an end to the open world economy. Now, I tend to think that this is also a low probability outcome, but that's probably because you've probably already realized I'm a great optimist. So I think the most likely is something like this: muddling through, lower oil prices, monetary and fiscal easing restore a degree of confidence. There's fiscal stimulus in surplus countries, as well as pick up in private spending and some spending in deficit countries. And this gives you a slow recovery. This is the sort of, either you regard this as a very long and shallow U in the debate. Economists have, or really something that looks quite L-ish, down like this and up like this. And that seems to me the most likely outcome. Now, let me just conclude with what I think this might mean for the reform agenda if we get to it. So assume we get through this and we have to think about the world is going to work macroeconomically thereafter. I think there is a big US adjustment ahead, also UK and other developed countries, and this is only possible with global growth, since I think their net exports have to improve considerably. They can't rely on this excess spending domestically. Other countries need to have smaller surpluses or bigger deficits. Now, oil exporters, I think, will be back. Right now, oil export surpluses are shrinking massively because prices are collapsing. Once the world economy recovers, which is what I'm thinking about, oil prices will rise. We will be concerned again about their savings, and I think they're structural because oil exporters have good reason to turn their assets into wealth. So part of the adjustment is that non-oil exporters reduce current account surpluses or increase deficits, and this means they must spend more relative to income, and China is the most important case. So how are emerging countries to run current account deficits safely, which is the theme of my book? And the answer is external finance must at least be relatively stable. And there are, I think, three elements in a solution. I would shift my emphasis now somewhat from the book. The first is equity investment. That's well known. There's nothing more to say. The second is almost complete reliance on local currency finance and the development of local currency bond markets, which is what Joe was talking about. And the third element is a big increase in collective insurance. And I've recently been arguing that the IMF, currently about $250 billion, needs to be at least an order of magnitude bigger to give countries the insurance they need and the assurance they need that they can get through crises. Of course, the development of local currency finance also depends on a sustainable fiscal position, a sound currency, a well-regulated financial system, and openness to foreign investors. And without those qualities, local currency will fail for both domestic residents and foreigners. But there wasn't, before this crisis, encouraging signs, and it has added a real element of robustness to emerging economies in this crisis, that emerging market local currency bonds, which are what's shown here, which I've taken from my book, are massively increased in scale, at least up to the middle years of this decade. I think it's a very important. But still more important is a much bigger global insurance system. The IMF's lending capacity, as I said, is about 250 billion. It needs to be an order of magnitude bigger, and that means a big re-engineering of voting weights. Today, believe it or not, Europe still has a third of the votes in the IMF. America has about another 18%, and that cannot last. So let me just, the conclusion of my argument for today is we have, I think, reached a real turning point. The end of the US and UK, Spain, a few other countries as borrowers and spenders of last resort in the entire global system. The natural limit of the Asian export-led mercantilist model of growth, the way I put this, is China cannot be South Korea. It's just too big to pursue that line of development. It has to be a more balanced growth model without these massive surplus savings. The reduction in internal imbalances in the US and other countries like this, the increased saving, the reduction in spending depends on reducing external imbalances at the same time while maintaining global economic growth. And so achieving this depends on big changes in the rest of the world and the massive reforms in the global financial system I have outlined. And the big point I would make in the conclusion, we got into this mess over a long time. We worked very hard to create it. It's going to take a lot of effort to get out of it, and unfortunately, it's not going to be easy. And the other thing I would stress, because it's not part of the American debate, as I read the American debate, this is a product of the global system. The US is embedded in the global system, and it cannot be durably resolved without changes in the global system. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, very much.